Hi, I'm Holly. I'm a freelance illustrator. I'm now based in London, but I've been based here for about 2 months, so I feel like a bit of a baby still. And I'm heading up to my first year of being a freelance illustrator. Before that, I was a graphic designer and a motion designer. So I'm just going to take you on a little bit of my journey to get to this point, some of my influences and kind of what I've learned about my work so far. I'm going to kick things off in 1996. It was a big year for me, the year I was born. To these two lovely people, my mum, who is Scottish, and my dad, who is Polish, and me, I'm also there. Um, yeah, I think the only Polish thing about me is my last name and my Polish side of the family, because in 1999, my parents took me and my sisters to England. We spent about a year in London and then we moved out to Surrey. I don't know if anyone's been to like Red Hill or Reigate. But from what I remember, it's very your quintessential sort of like English countryside experience. I spent a lot of time outside, a lot of time with my friends, a lot of time in school. And it felt very normal until 2005, when I was about 8 years old. My dad's job moved him out to Hong Kong, and we followed him out there. So obviously, this is as culturally as far from England as you can imagine it. At the time, I didn't really process the difference, but it really was going from spending weekends in like parks to spending weekends in market stalls where there's neon signs everywhere and the public transport's crowded. And visually, I look back and I see so much of the stuff I was exposed to at this age in my work now. There's characters on everything from like towels to toilet seats to snacks. I don't know if anyone's had white rabbits, but they're great. I think about them every day since then. And we stayed in Hong Kong for about 5 years until I was about a teenager. And my mum decided she had enough and took us home to Scotland. We then moved to a town just outside of Edinburgh called Dunbar. I don't know if you've ever been, probably not missing out on much if you don't go, but it's very idyllic, very chilled. But if you're a 14-year-old girl moving from Hong Kong, that's the worst thing that could ever happen to you because there's not a lot going on. So I spent a lot of time in my room drawing pictures, very annoyed that there wasn't much happening. Finished up my education there, and then I went to art school. The good thing about Scotland is that if you're there for long enough, you get to go to university for free, and the university is 4 years long. So I went to a school in Dundee, which is a city up kind of like the north of Scotland. Also, not an awful lot going on, but I think it's a great place to go to university because it is so cheap. And it's a big university city where they have a ton of different degrees. So you're really mixed up with a bunch of different people studying different things, and they give you a lot of freedom to choose what you want to study. I end up specializing in animation. And I used that 4 years to figure out that I don't like animating, but the course is really good in terms of giving you an overview of the entire pipeline. They try to get you to learn like modeling and rigging and design and storyboarding and compositing. That's obviously a lot to fit into 4 years. So I chose to pay attention to none of it, apart from the design and the drawing side of things, because that was what I was interested in. And at the time, I really, really loved the short films before the Disney feature films. So stuff like Feast and Inner Workings, anything that was like super stylized and had really nice storytelling was very much my jam. I also started to find out about motion graphics, which I feel like is quite late in retrospect, but studios like Moth at the time and Bach and really like the work of like Robin Davey, like this really graphic, stylized approach to design. And I really loved how it seemed like a much shorter experience than traditional animation. So if you're making a feature film or you're making an AAA game, it's going to be hundreds of people working on it for years, and you'll be responsible for a very, very small part of it. And what I loved about motion design was that you could go away on a weekend and make something and it would be done. So I decided to specialize in character design and motion design, which wasn't actually an option. I just decided it was going to be an option. So I taught myself After Effects because no one knew it. So I just went away and looked up a bunch of YouTube videos and started making things. I'm definitely one of those people who would rather make 100 things and have the last thing be good than spend 100 days on one project and not like the project at the end of it. So I made up a lot of my own projects. Ended up graduating because I was the only person in my year who'd sort of done motion graphics instead of doing traditional animation. I ended up doing that as a job for a couple of years, at first in-house for a company, joining their sort of like marketing team, and then joining a marketing agency to work for a bunch of different clients down the line. But I went full steam ahead on 2D and in After Effects until COVID hit. And I did what every designer says they're going to do. And I said I was going to learn Blender. And it did take a global pandemic and being locked inside, but I did it. So I used my spare time. I was still working, but I had a lot of holiday accrued and nowhere to go. So I used my days off to just jump on YouTube, did the donut tutorial by Blender Guru, did some tutorials by a guy called Southern Shotty. He does Skillshare and YouTube videos. They're fantastic. And I kind of fell in love with the software. I think compared to uni, where it was very technical, I don't know if anyone's used Maya. I remember back in like 2014, Maya was not fun to use. And I think the version of Blender that was then out in 2021 was very different. I found it a lot easier to use. And I fell in love with the ability to be able to create something in a couple of hours, add some lighting, make your own silly thing. And I kind of made it my mission to create something new every week and put it online. And this was while I was working. So I would get up early in the morning or work weekends or work evenings. And I just had so much fun with it. And it was the silliest of things. There's really no point to this. I just got really into making cats and making these little worlds. I started to think about characters again because I really do love characters. But at that point, I didn't have the technical knowledge to figure out what I wanted them to look like. So it was very much this mismatch of the way I wanted things to look and my technical ability. And then I think last year was the year when things started to really click for me. I started creating more and more work and kind of developing my style and how I wanted my characters to look. I started to take influence from other illustration work and tell more stories. Started playing with things a bit more. I think with my design choices, I'm quite influenced by 2D and I'm like, cool, if I want one character to have a small leg and one character to have a big leg and have stuff floating in space, why not? No one is telling me to do anything. No one's making the rules. And then I started to learn more techniques, which helped me build things out differently. Started to play with angles. I think that's the perk of using 3D work. It's easy to rotate things and look at things in different ways and experiment with things. I think that's something that still influences my work today. And then I made an interesting life choice where I quit my job and I handed in the notice on my flat and I went traveling for a year. So I told my parents I was taking a gap year. And my intention was, I had money saved up, but my intention was to get some design work freelance. And it turns out the only work I ever get is illustration work, which is good because I think the work you put out there is kind of the work you get hired for. So I feel like I've lucked out to get some illustration clients. So I spent my whole year running around. So I was in Spain, I was in France, spending my time between like co-working spaces and cafes and the beach. Took my first trip to America, which was really fun. Went to like LA and New York. Spent a lot of time alone in airports. And then I just like looked for a lot of good dessert places, which is probably how you should spend a gap year. But one of the things I really enjoyed about taking some time off was figuring out what I wanted my style to be. I think because I'd never worked in illustration before, I wanted to develop my tastes and understand what the industry was actually like. So I spent a lot of time researching what I actually liked, figured out what could influence my work and what the roots are for what I do now. And the first thing I'm really into is kind of like 2D clean vector shapes. I don't know how apparent this is in my work now, or if it's like a hang up from my motion design days, but I'm obsessed with how clean and simple and appealing this stuff is. And I think it's quite deceptive in a way because it's a lot harder to do than it looks. But I think I look through my feed on Instagram and everything I follow is just beautiful, beautiful vector work that I wish I had the ability to pull off, that I try and take as much of that into my 3D work as possible. And I look at a lot of 3D artists as well. I think it's really important to not take from anyone directly, but look at how different people approach different things and realize there is a variety of work. I think there's a certain expectation that 3D work looks a certain way. So I like to find specific people doing it in their own way and realizing you can have your own voice and you can approach things in different ways. And maybe they're Cinema 4D people, maybe they're Blender people, maybe they use like actual physical sets, which I find really, really cool. And figuring out like what the way they approach materials or the way they approach 3D space, like what can you learn from it? what do you want to steal, what do you want to stay away from, to kind of find your own voice. And another thing I'm very, very obsessed with is characters, but especially what I call wonky characters. I took a Skillshare course by Anastasia Shralik called Not Boring Characters, and it really changed the way I thought about everything. Because I think that's what illustration is for. I think design is about solving problems, but illustration, I think, is about bringing joy and communicating something. But for me, it is about that special something that you wouldn't get without a picture. It's about sparking joy. It's about bringing some sort of vision to someone's mind, and it's about making people happy, really, at least for me. And I feel like if you have the standard person with like one head, two arms, two legs, what's the point? Why not do something different because you can? And I think the challenge for me is finding these characters that defy logic and trying to translate them into 3D, because it's sometimes very easy to do in line work, but harder to do when you're modeling. But I think that's where the magic happens. And the other part that I'm kind of trying to build into my work now is wonky perspective. Obviously, if you're working in 3D, it's quite easy to get correct perspective because you just build out the set and you put a camera there and it's done for you, compared to if you're illustrating by hand. But I'm really inspired by a lot of Korean illustrators and a lot of like childlike illustration where we give up on perspective completely and everything's quite flat. And that's really difficult to do in 3D, but I love the way it looks. So I'm trying to incorporate more and more of that into my work, whether it's like breaking models or looking at things at a certain angle. I have noticed a lot of my clients are fine with me just handing over image files or PSDs. So I'm happy to cheat things as long as you get that nice final image to kind of get the aesthetic I'm going for. And I think, especially in my mind, where I'm trying to go for something quite whimsical and quite joyful, it helps me communicate that in a way that your classic isometric 3D wouldn't. And now I'm going to dive a little bit into my process and kind of how my influences have not combined with my process, but maybe linked in. So I usually start with really, really ugly sketches. I make lots and lots of these. They take a very short amount of time, and it's just a way of me getting the images out of my head and onto the paper. I never show these to clients because they don't really communicate much to anyone apart from me. But it's a quick way to experiment with things. And then as soon as I'm happy with the rough sketch, I bring them into Vector, jump into Illustrator, and figure out what I want the piece to actually look like. This is kind of where all the thinking happens. What I love about Illustrator is that it's easy to play with proportions and experiment with things, whether that's colors or composition. Once you've drawn the thing, you can easily move it up and down, move it around, as opposed to working with sketches where you'd have to do the same drawing over and over and over again. So I find it a really efficient way to work. But again, it's probably like a hang up from my motion design days that I refuse to let go of. But I usually talk to the client at the stage. We'll hand over a bunch of these files. We'll talk about colors. And once that's all signed off, we'll bring the thing into 3D. For me, this is more of a technical stage where I basically take whatever the image was and build it into 3D. Sometimes I need to find the right method to create the right shapes, and sometimes I'll regret designing something that is difficult to make in 3D. But the more I practice this and the more I work in 3D, I tend to know what's going to work and what's not going to work and what method I'm going to use. So I don't know if anyone's a Blender user or how helpful this is going to be, but here are a couple of my favorite techniques that have really helped me figure out my style. The first one is just simply using thick curves. I love this because you can make an entire character in like 2 seconds by having like a sphere for the head, a curve for the arms, and a curve for the legs. But if you're making like eyebrows or arms or lines or whatever, it's the easiest way to just make something. Just create a Bezier curve and it's there. If you're using like modeling, it takes so much longer. My other favorite method for organic shapes is the skin modifier. So you simply, it's going to work. Let's try that one. Great. No. Maybe? Okay, it doesn't want to play that one, but the skin modifier. Create a single vert, add a skin modifier, a bunch of subdivision surfaces, and it creates this lovely blobby shape you can manipulate. And it feels a lot more like working with clay or sculpting than it does modeling for me. I've never worked with VR, but I imagine if you're working with VR, it has that same sort of feeling where it's quite blobby and it feels like you're working with something tactile rather than something technical. And because I work with vectors a lot, I have a ton of SVGs to hand. So if there's something very specific that I want to make, I can just import the SVG and use that as the base for a mesh, which saves me so much time, especially if there's a shape with a ton of different angles. So I don't have to fight Blender to get the exact shape I'm looking for. Really useful if you're working with text as well. And finally, my favorite technique is just using the actual sculpt tool. I think the good thing about Blender is that there are so many tools built into the one program. Um, so for the sculpt mode, I simply model all the different parts I need, mesh them together, remesh the whole sculpt and smooth it away, and then I'll retopologize after. Really helpful for you doing portraits. I don't know how often that will come up for people, but sometimes if there's no other way to model something, I'll just model the parts I need and then build it in post. Yeah, so I'd like to take you through some of the stuff I've had the pleasure of working on over the last year. This is one of my favourite projects I got to work on with Ragged Edge, who I think are also in London. So they asked me to contribute illustrations to their rebrand of Omlet, who are a pet brand based in Oxford. And the brief was to capture the whimsy and humour of the brand and help it stand out in the marketplace. Lucky for me, they kind of had already approved my style or were on board with the way I make things, which is always so much easier than trying to present a whole brand new style to a client. And they basically gave me a brief of some pets that Omlet make products for and told me to come back with designs for them. So I went away, did a bunch of sketching behind the scenes, and then came up with a bunch of vector options for the client to choose from. It was great to be able to like play with proportion and play with shape and play with different languages to see what would resonate, especially if you're comparing all these animals together, because you have a dog and you have a cat and you have a rabbit, and obviously they're all different sizes, and figuring out what color schemes would work together. If we're doing something quite fun or quite naturalistic, what the eye shapes could look like. We went through a ton of these back and forth. It was really interesting as well with the cats and the dogs, thinking about breeds, obviously, because you can have dogs that are massive and dogs that are tiny, and we wanted to create something that would be universal um, and be appealing to everyone. So we kind of created this more imaginary space rather than going for a specific breed. And once these were all approved, we went away and created the 3D. We ended up doing 2 poses for each animal and a setting. So here's the chicken, the bird, the dog, cat, guinea pig, which I think is my favorite, depending on the day I look at these, and the hamster and the rabbit. And then my favorite part was being able to hand these all off to Ragged Edge when they were signed off, to get them to pop them into the branding system, which was really a great experience for me because I don't think I'd ever worked as an illustrator with branding before. And I think it really elevates the illustrations to see them in a new context. And obviously they're really good at what they do. So they've done a fantastic job. And my other favorite part of the project was these icons. I think I've made a lot of icons as a designer, but never 3D icons. So it was really fun to try and figure out how to kind of create this idea of like whimsy that we create in the main illustrations, but make them legible on quite a small scale, and kind of figuring out a back and forth for that to work as well. And then the animation part. As someone who studied animation, I was really glad I didn't have to do this because it's really hard. So my friend Adam, he I think brought these ones to life, and he's done such a good job. I really do feel like it adds a level of life I wasn't ever expecting. Um, I really enjoy watching these and just seeing the amount of character he's managed to add to my illustrations, and he's made me want to go away and actually learn how to animate properly. Another project I got invited to do was this one. We did a bunch of different illustrators were asked to do staff portraits for Wieden Kennedy in London, which was a really interesting experience because I had never worked with actual likenesses before. I love making characters, but only imaginary characters. I didn't want to be too mean to people. So I think the challenge was trying to capture someone's likeness, but also keep the stylization that they wanted to have. So my port of call was basically jump into Illustrator again everyone's favorite program, and make a bunch of different variations. So hopefully someone could choose something that they were happy with. Trying out different color schemes and different shape language for each of the people. And here are some of my favorites. I think my favorite part of this whole project was also being able to go down to the London offices and see them unveiled on the walls and meet the other illustrators. It was fantastic to see like how everyone approached it in such a different way. I think sometimes as an illustrator, you think the way you think is the only way, is the way that everyone thinks. And that's not true. Everyone has like a different approach to something. And I think as a freelancer, you spend a lot of time at your desk by yourself or like behind emails. So it's always good to have the opportunity to meet someone in person, and both get to meet like the other illustrators, but meet the staff we got to do portraits of, which was super, super fun. And then AR Advent. I think you guys know what an Advent calendar is, but I was trying to explain this to someone the other day. But this project was in its second year. So I was a big fan of the first year it ran. But Sandra, who runs it, is a designer. She's a great VR or AR designer and animator. So she invites illustrators and animators from around the world to contribute a short animation to count down to Christmas. And in the second year, she invited me through to be part of it, which was really fun. So I definitely said yes, and I gave animation a go. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but we also got paired with a sound designer for the first time, which was a really fun experience for me. So it's my first time animating in Blender and my first time working with a sound designer. I created just a short animation inspired by Polish folk art. And I got to go to London to meet some of the other illustrators involved in this project and see the actual AR aspect come to life. Because we were working online and you just play the animation, but if you have the physical poster or one of the displays, I think it was displayed in a couple of different places. One was in London, I think a couple in Germany, and I think one in the US as well. But you can take your phone, get the app, and then scan the door, and it will open, and you can actually see the little animation, which is probably beyond my knowledge of how AR works, but it was a really fun thing to be part of. And then I think this was one of the first projects I worked on. So when going freelance. And this is Football Beyond Borders Forward Play. This was organised by Eve Warren, where she invited a bunch of illustrators to do portraits of footballers for the Women's World Cup to raise money. I was assigned, I'm going to say Ada Hegerberg. I'm going to pretend that I pronounced that right, but she's incredible. I was watching a ton of videos of hers. And just watching her play was so inspiring. So I did these incredibly high fidelity sketches. But I really wanted to capture like the dynamism of the way she played and some of that movement. And I came up with these portraits. I really wanted to focus more on not her face, but the way she moves. I think that's the impressive part of sports players. I think we put a lot of pressure on women to look a certain way or act a certain way. And I think when you're looking at athletes, it's so much more interesting to see what they have accomplished from a sports aspect. So I wanted to take a lot of the pressure away from the portrait side of things and make it more about the sport. And I feel like this project has kind of inspired a lot of my style going forward, because I really like working with perspective and working with dynamic angles. And that's the final image in the magazine. And yeah, that takes me to kind of the end, which is where we are now. I'm still chipping away at personal work. I feel like I'm still such a baby on my illustration journey. I've been very lucky in that all my clients have kind of referenced my personal work for projects. So I made it a big part of my practice to keep making this work and figuring out what I want to make going forward. I keep pushing myself because I've figured you don't get hired for stuff you're not going to make. But here's some of the things I made in early 2024. But I'm hoping I can continue to make more work and evolve my style, because I think I'm happy with how far I've come since last year. But I'm really, really excited for what could happen the next couple of years. I'm just really, really grateful that I get to do this as a job, because it doesn't feel like a real job sometimes. And I'm glad it resonates with people. I think that takes us to the end of my talk. So thank you so much for sitting through all of that.
We had ourselves on mute the whole time, but we were smiling and laughing. So
I like how I asked a lot of questions and then just didn't wait for the answer.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate you taking us through that. And you said about the fact that your work kind of elicits a sense of joy. It definitely was smiles on lots of people's faces as you were taking us through. So appreciate that. Maybe I can start with a question because the craft that you have is something that I definitely could not do. It's definitely not something that I have the ability to even imagine. When you're creating a character, obviously you said that you go into, I don't know what you do before Illustrator. Is that done like on an iPad or
Oh
something?
yeah.
Okay.
Procreate. Sometimes Sketchbook, like with like Sharpie, but sometimes Procreate.
So when you're creating those, do you have to almost start to create a little bit of a persona behind them before you start stylistically thinking through how they kind of look in a frame? Like, do you start to give them like names, backgrounds, jobs, what or characteristics, so that it
I
helps to?
think it does depend. I think it's very dependent on the brief as well. Like sometimes I think with the Omelette project specifically, it was great because the team, we were doing back and forth and we started labeling people and we had like the chicken was Barbara and that was really exciting to kind of have that backstory. And you do relate to them a lot more when you have this kind of story to them. And I think some of the feedback I've gotten from art directors is that people really resonate to details. And one of sometimes the things I like to do is I like people watching. So I'll be really creepy when I'm on the tube, where I will make notes of what people are wearing, what people are doing. And then I have this like backlog in my mind of like outfit choices or like expressions and poses. And then when I'm drawing something, I'll kind of draw on things I've seen from real life. So I'm like, hey, I'm going to draw my friend Susie, and Susie wears this kind of jumper. And then, or like my boyfriend wears this kind of like trainer. And it's like taking all these elements from real life and putting it into my work.
I hope I'm not in any of those photographs or those sketches. Well, that makes a lot of sense because I imagine, especially if you move into animation, um, kind of understanding how that character behaves is probably an easy way to then suggest how the kind of the movements or the accentuations of how someone's body changes and flexes. Because it was actually I think it was the last project you showed with the football. It was really interesting to kind of see the perspective that you took because there's a lot of footballers who actually, if you look at the detail of how they move, they're quite a kind of a key component of that person, like a Raheem Sterling. If I said that as a footballer, yeah, he kind of runs a little bit like a scared dinosaur. And it's kind of like those kind of characteristics help you to understand who they are beyond what they look like. That reference is probably lost on a lot of people if they don't know who.
It's a really good one, though, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah, an illustrator that would be so good.
anyone else got a question? You've landed on quite an interesting material choice, and I don't know if that's the correct term, but like the kind of the finish on the renders. How did you get to that point? Because there's obviously a lot of stylistic choices that illustrators use from, especially the materiality, whether it be shiny, whether it be inflated, whatever it may be. What was the process that you went through to land on that kind of, I'm butchering, by the way, the phrase, but
Yeah.
material?
No, it's really interesting because I always go like roughness 100%. I'm like, no material, nothing, give me no realism whatsoever. And I think it comes from my like 2D influence. I think I'm so in love with 2D illustrators and like that flat vector feel. Um, that I don't want my work to feel like 3D because I find it really ironic to introduce myself as a 3D artist because I feel like I'm not that into 3D. Like never give me a technical 3D task. I'm not interested. But I think it's trying to replicate that 2D feel. So I'll sometimes paint on my illustrations to give them a textured feel. I'll sometimes put the roughness up, but I think it is just trying to find something that feels clean and feels like myself. I also feel like part of it is technical limitations. I think when I started out, I was just using this clay shader that was really popular at the time. And the more and more I make stuff, I'm like, this is not actually adding that much. I just want to have this one flat color and replicate as close as I can to the Illustrator sketch. And I think because Illustrator is just like vector colors, I'm just trying to get that one-to-one.
Oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Good question.
Oh, good. There you go. Good question.
So I was looking at your work before we came into the session, and there was one thing that you did. I can't remember what it was, but it really made me think of an artist called Kellyanna who played the proportion quite a lot.
Yeah.
But she had a very defined way of showing proportion. So you'll pretty much see the same play and proportion all of her work, and what tends to be different is more like, I suppose, the context of the story of the image. And you sort of talked about proportion a little bit earlier on, and a lot of your work's got very different expressions of proportion to create, the footballer example, which is a specific, the proportion of actually, like, the leg length or whatever it might be. And I was just curious to know whether you think, and you might have an answer for this, you think whether you'll always have a very varied approach to proportion, or whether you might sort of define a sense of what proportion means for you through your work?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think I struggle because I get bored really, really easily and I like to change things. I think if I've done something once, I never want to do it again, which is not very helpful if you're an illustrator trying to define a style. So for me, it's all about experimentation. I'm hoping if I do find something um, unique, it will start repeating itself in the work. But also for me, I think sometimes if you work on a client brief, like if you're doing a branding project, you kind of want that illustration language to be specific to that client. Like I never want to create the exact same illustration for every project I do, because then what's my job as an illustrator? You can just buy something I've already made and just like slap it on there. I think there's a fun element to be able to like craft your style to match your brief.
And I suppose that's the difference in a way between doing commercial work and doing your sort of like own work. And I think, using the Kellyanna reference point, I feel like her style became what people, that very clear proportion thing became what people wanted to buy and put in their commercial work. Whereas it feels like what people are buying is almost the sort of like character and the sort of like personas that you create versus the specific execution through like form and shape and stuff.
Yeah, I always find it really interesting to figure out where illustrators have come from and how they approach things. Because some people are like total storyteller illustrators where you're buying them for the aesthetic and it's very surface like level visual thing. And then if you look at the animation world, people are really versatile. And they tend to create something completely different for every project, even though you can kind of see their underlying style run through it. And I find it really fascinating that I feel like I've kind of come from two different worlds to figure out what clients are asking for. And I do feel like I'm just making it up as I go along some of the time.
Yeah, I had a question, but I think Pav stole it. I was going to ask something along the lines of the difference between, I guess, mastering one style versus being sort of open to shifting around. But I feel like you've kind of answered that. So I might just take it in a very different direction. How do you currently feel about the introduction of obviously AI into the design industry and what that could look like for illustrators, designers, and anyone that does anything creative?
Yeah, I do find it interesting because I feel like I look back at some of the work I was doing my first couple of years, especially in the marketing space. When someone hands you a set of brand guidelines and you're doing some really like basic motion design, I feel like you could automate that so quickly. And would the world be at a loss? I'm not sure. I think for the work I do now, I do it for the joy of it. It's great that people sometimes give me money. So I feel like I'm going to still keep making it, even if people stop paying me for it. Um, but I do think there's something about voice and defining your own style and having your own creative approach. Because I'm looking at some of the AI work that's out there, and I find people who aren't artists, the AI work they make isn't that good, or the stuff they choose is pretty generic and it all looks the same. But I look at the AI work made by artists that I like, and it's got such a unique voice and it's got such a unique point of view that even though it was generated by Midjourney, it feels like something only they could have made because of that taste. So I feel like maybe art direction is the way things are going. Do I know how it's going to play out from a client management side of things and money making kind of side of things? Not a clue. I'm kind of waiting for everyone just to get like free money and we can all go do what we want. That'll be great.
A lot of a lot of the work that you just showed, obviously, it's they're not human, but they're kind of based either on humans or animals. Have you ever kind of animated an inanimate object? Like bring personification to something that just does not have life?
I feel like that would be super fun. I feel like I'm going to add it to my list of things to do. I think,
Okay.
yeah, I do like putting smiley faces on everything. So I feel like as long as I have a smiley face on it, it will feel like a character. That's the kicker.
Well, it's interesting because as soon as you do that, you create a sense of personality behind any object. It should be interesting to see how you would bring something that actually has no physical life to life. And the other side is then what are the expressions from the movement side of things?
No, I think that's really interesting. I think when you kind of come from the animation world, you see so many like short films and so many videos. It's really interesting to see how we look for life and we look for expression in everything. Like it takes two circles and a line and you will see a face in it. So I think the same thing is true with animation. Like you could just watch a ball moving around and you still feel the personality of the ball. And I think that's very much like lesson number one in animation is like, how can you get a feeling into movement?
And that kind of leads on to a question that I have. Obviously working in 3D, like, well, digital kind of 3D, there's like a tactility to the work. Have you kind of any intentions or have you ever tried kind of working that into physical objects in space?
Not yet, but that is definitely one of my like dreams for this year. I think I spend too much time on screen, so just seeing stuff in real life, even if it's just a case of like printing things out, but actually making things. I've been really obsessed with some of the shopping mall takeovers. I don't know if you've seen this. It's very big in Asia, in like Tokyo, Korea, where they have these like great big sculptures in their shopping malls, and there's so much character with it, and it just lives. It lives in like window displays, and it's just so exciting. And I don't know if I'll ever get one of these projects, but I'm manifesting it for some point in my career that I get to make some like actual stuff that exists in the real world.
Yeah, I could imagine that's looking very cool.
Well, how far of a departure would it be if you connect? I don't know enough about 3D printing.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to be able to utilize the stuff that you create in Blender to actually physically produce them as objects?
Hypothetically, I know a lot of illustrators like send their work out to 3D modelers to model it and then make models from it. So I'm sure it's possible. I just haven't thought about it yet. I think my issue is that I make so much stuff that I don't invest long enough into one piece that I'm like, I'd much rather make like 100 new illustrations than focus on one character and use it over and over and over again. So maybe when I sort my commitment issues, I will get on that.
Well, it just seems that if you kind of reverse the process out, make these into 3D models, then stop frame animation them. It's the idea of maybe bring your characters into the real world, which would be super exciting. Anyway, enough with the ideas. Unless there was any other questions, I'd first like to just say thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
It was exactly what you said the work makes you feel like for something that we're definitely like that way to myself, and I'm sure the same with everyone here. So I think there's a lot of people who take joy from this. So we really appreciate it. And welcome to London as well.
Yeah.
But apart from that, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
See you later.
Talk later. Bye.